Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for tuning into the show. This is your host, Adelia Kirchner, and you are listening to Subtle Rampage.
Warning, the following program contains critical thinking, honest opinions, viewpoints on culture that may seem conservative, and a positive view on absolute detestable things such as marriage and children. Listener discretion is advised.
Hello, my free-thinking friends. I hope your mood is nice and peachy today because I've discovered this thing called a podcast. It's my own original idea. Nobody's ever thought of this before. I did, in fact, come up with the name myself. Don't ask me what the roots of the word are or anything. I just was speaking gibberish, and then the word podcast came out of my mouth, and I was like, you know what? This is an ingenious idea. And I don't know if anybody else will ever do a podcast. I think I'm probably the only one who has one right now and whoever will have one. So I just wanted to take a second to put a verbal copyright on the whole concept of a podcast so that everybody knows that I'm the one who came up with it. Sound good to you? Sounds good to me. Great. Anyways, in this context, this being a podcast and all means that I'm the only one talking, which I think is kind of beautiful because that means that there's nobody to scream at me and there's nobody to scream at you. This is kind of a prelude episode to give you an idea of who I am and what this podcast is, but I just kind of want to start off this episode by explaining why I'm doing this podcast in the first place. I mean, everybody on planet Earth has a podcast at this point, except they don't because I'm the only one who has one, obviously, as we've already established. But, okay, being realistic here, okay, why even bother doing this? And I'm just gonna put this out there. It's partially for selfish reasons. I do like to talk quite a bit, and I like to talk quite a bit about my own opinions, as my friends and family will tell you. But it's also partially because over the last couple years, and I mean even longer to be honest, but especially over the last couple years with COVID and everything, things have gotten quite tense in the United States. I'm sure you've noticed, whether you are Republican or Democrat, whether you're in the middle, whether you're a libertarian on one side or the other, whether you're a person who makes it your sole purpose in life to not get involved in politics, it doesn't really matter because everything is political now. And, and people say that, right? But in my opinion, in modern day, it's not really avoidable. But, it really doesn't matter where you stand on things. I'm sure you can acknowledge that you haven't been able to really avoid it over the last several years, and that things are very tense when interacting with people who don't think like you if both of you are not making a point to be very civil. And that can be kind of frustrating, but I think the problem here, if you ask me, is that people are so emotionally invested in these issues that they can't handle themselves properly. And I think it's important for you to be emotionally invested in things. It's good to be invested and passionate about certain issues. There's a reason you are capable of those emotions, okay? If people weren't emotionally invested, if people weren't passionate about ending slavery in this country, it would still be around. If people weren't passionate about certain issues, we wouldn't have solved any problems. So there is a reason, there is a positive aspect to being emotionally involved in these big ticket items, okay? I'm not saying that you can't have emotions about things, but I think when you get to a certain point of emotional investment, it just makes things worse. We wouldn't necessarily approve of the type of emotional investment that people have in politics. We wouldn't necessarily approve of that in a situation where, say, a parent, okay, has a child, and they're out in public, in the grocery store, okay? And say that child went down the toy aisle and saw a toy and was like, hey, I want this. And the parent was like, That's not what we're here for. We're here to get broccoli. And the kid just starts screaming and kicking and throwing a huge fit on the floor of the grocery store. A parent might be emotionally invested in the behavior of their child, might be emotionally invested in how that behavior causes people to perceive their child, causes people to perceive their family, causes people to perceive their parenting. But should they be so emotionally invested that they aren't able to handle the situation properly as a parent? Most people would say no, right? I mean, maybe I'm alone here, but I'm pretty sure most people would say no. You shouldn't be so emotionally invested in something that you can't handle yourself properly as a mature adult. So I think that's one of our big issues in the United States right now, is that so many people are so passionate, so emotionally invested in specific issues that they're not handling themselves with maturity. They're not handling themselves with civility in order to interact properly with people who they disagree with. That's just what I've noticed personally. But that kind of brings us to my main reason for doing this podcast. For those of you who are young, people that dare to think differently than a large percentage of your generation does, I would like to offer you, right here, right now, a sense of sanity. Okay? I'm extending a palm leave to you, okay? Or whatever the expression is. Because personally, I think that over the last several years, it's kind of been declining, but definitely during COVID and definitely right now, I don't think there's really that much respite for young people who lean more conservative. And, and older people who lean more conservative. But I think where the difference comes in is that you're not reading articles on baby boomers and the generation right after that. You're not reading articles on them about how their whole generation is defined by diversity and inclusion and all of these things that kind of define the left at the moment. But you will see articles on millennials and Gen Z where it's like, they're the most accepting generation and all this stuff. And it's like, well, if that was completely true, that would be great in a sense. But we're not really the most accepting generation. Otherwise, young conservatives would not feel so isolated. But I do kind of want to talk about how there's really not much respite in terms of social media, TV, movies, academia. Like, none of that gives conservative voices an ounce of comfort. It just doesn't. Like, on social media, it's very easy to, like, get on there for, like, 5 minutes and be like, oh, wow, I'm the only person who thinks like this that's my age. What even? Unless you make a point of following certain figures or political commentators, right? Or unless your close circle of friends thinks the way that you do, like, it's very easy to be like, oh, wow, all these people who are my age think the complete opposite. What do I do with that? Do I just sit here all day and argue with people in the DMs? Or, because that sounds really immature and it's probably not going to go anywhere. What do I do with this? So, you've got social media and then you've got traditional news outlets. And honestly, I think even the conservative ones, it's hard to watch traditional news. And I think part of that is because it's definitely not catered towards young people. Some of us have not watched the traditional news outlets our entire life. We're not necessarily as trusting of them as older generations may have been. And so I think it's difficult to watch those, and I think it's difficult to find commonalities in those voices. And then definitely with TV and movies, I mean, I think we all kind of know that Hollywood itself is really left-leaning. You can't really watch a TV show or a movie without having some sort of ideology in there that's more associated with the left side of the political aisle. Name practically any TV show or movie on Netflix or Hulu or definitely HBO, things like that, okay? Like, you can't find much in modern day that screams conservative values unless you go watch a crappy movie on PureFlix. But that's just because they don't have as big of a budget. But ultimately, those outlets don't provide any sense of camaraderie with the conservatives. They don't. And then you've got YouTube. Okay, even YouTube is hard sometimes, because I'm sure there's plenty of people out there who think more along the lines of the conservative side of things. Don't get me wrong. But it's kind of frustrating because there have been people that I subscribed to on YouTube when I was in middle school. Okay, I've been following these people for years, right? Bought their merch, talked about them, was obsessed with them, watched their videos every week or every day or whenever they posted, right? Okay, and then COVID hits, and all of a sudden, everything is about COVID. And it's like, I wanted to sit down and escape that topic because it's an everyday thing, in 2020 and even 2021. Okay, like this is a problem that's in my daily life. And then I sit down, I go microwave a burrito, right? And I sit down in my bed after work and I just turn on YouTube and I'm like, I'm gonna watch a video that's gonna distract me from the woes of this world. And then I spend the first 2 minutes of an intro to a video listening to somebody scream about anti-maskers and how terrible they are. Or later on, how terrible anti-vaxxers are and how they're killing everybody and how this is, like, so terrible. And it's like, you can have your opinion, but how are you going to alienate part of your audience like that? But, the thing is that a lot of them don't necessarily mind alienating that part of their audience. Some people that I've watched make it very, very clear that they would prefer it if people who were conservative or people who didn't agree with the masks or people who were still going out in public this year, they would prefer it if those people didn't watch their videos. And that aspect of things is definitely frustrating. I'd be like, I've been your fan for like 6 or 7 years, but I guess now I'm not allowed to watch your content. Awesome. Glad you have a good, strong following now and that my one view doesn't matter to you. But I am kind of bummed. Guess I'll just eat my burrito in quiet. That's kind of my thing about that. And then don't even get me started on academia in the world of higher education. I'll definitely be getting into that in later episodes because there's not much space for conservative thought or any sort of thought that doesn't line up with leftist ideologies in the realm of academia. It's very, very rare that there's any space for that. So we'll definitely be talking about that. And then another aspect of life where I feel like young conservatives might feel kind of isolated is the older generation of conservatives. There are plenty of outspoken people, don't get me wrong, but I'm talking the type of conservatives who don't talk about politics. They don't talk about anything. They think a certain way, but they don't talk about it. They just live their lives and pretend that they don't have to ever say anything about what they think, and it'll all be fine. And, to each their own, right? But, if I say, I believe this, and this is why I'm doing this, etc., and I get a response from a full-grown adult who's been around for decades, and I get a response from them where they're like, well, I don't really understand why you're taking such a strong stance on this. Don't you know how that'll affect your relationships? Don't you know how that'll affect your education? Just pretend you agree with your professor for that paper and, and get a good grade and move on. And it's like, what? I feel like that's why conservatives have gotten to this point where we are even feeling isolated, is because people have not been speaking up for so long. And, you've just been kind of like surfing through life, pretending you don't ever have to stand up because that's just how you make it in life. It's just kind of one of those things where I'm like, no, I'm doing this for a reason, and if you don't get it, that's fine, but it is kind of weird that you don't get it since we technically agree on these things. Obviously, one of us feels a bit stronger about it than the other. But I just think the importance of validation and having like-minded people around you, like, you can't underestimate the importance of that. You just, you can't. I think people who line up more with the left side of things, I think they do get a lot of validation and they get a lot of course you're right, yes you're right, I'm so glad you think that way. There's a lot more community, I think, at least online and in like all these outlets, I think there's a lot more community around people who think the way the left does versus people who think the way the right does. So, like, you had during COVID, some people who were going to college and they were stuck in a dorm room for a semester or for a year or for a year and a half, depending on what state you were in. Okay, they were stuck in a dorm room doing classes online. No clubs were meeting. Like, they weren't socializing. And especially if these people were freshmen, I'm sure they felt so alone in their views. Like, how are you supposed to find other people who think like you if you're not even given the chance to look for them? So yeah, that's just kind of one of my main reasons for doing this podcast. And, you know, one more thing. One more thing I almost forgot. Okay, geographical location matters so freaking much. So much. I've spent most of my life living in, not living directly in city centers, but kind of living like on the outskirts of city centers, okay? Tampa, Nashville, like living like right outside of those big city areas, okay? Living right outside of Dallas, Texas, okay? And city centers tend to lean towards the left. They just do. It is the way that it is. And so living near these city centers made it a bit more difficult to feel like there were other people who thought like me. But the reality is that you literally drive 30 minutes. There's more people who think like more conservative, more Republican. Drive an hour away from the city center. You're going to find even more people. Drive 2 hours away from the city center. You're going to find even more people. And of course, people are going to argue, oh, well, that's because they're less educated. You're going more into the rural communities. And it's like, well, okay, maybe you can take the less educated route, but I'd also like to take the, the preservation of morals, the preservation of family and the family unit, the preservation of all these values that are kind of done away with when we focus on just the individual. So you go out to these rural communities, you have an importance placed on family, an importance placed on community, an importance placed on physical labor and putting effort into things and all this stuff. And there's not the same emphasis on those things in city centers and in bigger city areas. There's just not. Even in suburbia, there's just not really that same emphasis on those things. Because we get blinded by things that are more, quote-unquote, important in those areas. But yeah, so I mean, for those of you who have lived in city centers or lived near city centers your whole life, and you think conservative and you felt alone, drive an hour away from a city center and see how many people you can find that agree with you. It's very encouraging, to say the least. It just is. It is very comforting to know that there are more people who think like you. But I guess for those of you who don't know me, I'll just give you a brief spiel on who I am real quick. I grew up homeschooled. I'm a Christian. I'm the oldest of 7 kids. Got 3 younger brothers, 3 younger sisters, the works. I'm from a low-income background, so I've moved around quite a lot. Not ever really under the best of circumstances, but that's fine. Life happens. Sometimes it's not great. We learn, we grow. All the optimistic things that I don't really believe that I'll say for you. I'm not really a very optimistic person, so if I say something positive and it comes across disingenuous, it's because I don't know how to be positive, if I'm being completely honest with you. But I think the things that I've experienced throughout the 2 decades that I've been alive, they leave plenty of room for common ground with people I might not necessarily agree with on everything. And, you know, it might even be interesting to see what we personally agree on just because we have similar life experiences. Like, for instance, me and this one girl, I'm very much conservative, she's very much liberal, we disagree on practically everything. but we both grew up in low-income households. We both had very similar experiences growing up. We both had very similar experiences getting into college and dealing with the financial aid aspect of things and dealing with the whole, oh, you're low income? Can we share your story? It's so empowering. We want you so much. You're so great. And it's like, oh, it's almost like we meet your low income quota, and that's why you're so happy to have us. No, but, you know, like, there's things that, you know, we might agree on just because we've had similar life experiences. And so I always think those are, like, really interesting conversations, because you could come from, like, a very similar background or even the same background and end up thinking completely differently. And I just think that's very interesting, honestly. However, with that being said, I know not everybody is going to be looking for that common ground. I know not everybody's going to be open to finding it. And I'm quite honest about my values, and I don't budge very easily. So my grandest apologies if that offends you. But if you disagree with my viewpoints, I encourage you to do one of two things. Either try to be open and try to look for that common ground, okay? Or your other option is hate listen, okay? Just like people hate watch on YouTube, or they hate watch movies, okay? Hate listen to the podcast, man. Most of my bookshelf is hate reads. I highly encourage this type of behavior, because if you're actually reading or you're actually listening versus just getting worked up over everything, it can be beneficial to read or listen or watch things that you don't like. It's a good way to understand both sides of an argument, or at the very least to try to get a grasp on how to argue back against something that you disagree with. Like, I'm finally reading White Fragility. I'm finally doing it. I know it's been out for several years, and it was making the rounds for a while. It's still making the rounds in academia, which is why I'm still going to read it. But yeah, so I'm finally reading that. Another example, I read The Second Sex by Simone de Beauvoir, okay? That's not exactly somebody that I would be like, oh my goodness, I agree with this person wholeheartedly. Let me read her work. No, okay. I'm not necessarily on board with her type of feminism, right? That's not necessarily my views. But I did read The Second Sex by de Beauvoir, and I underlined it, took notes, okay, and I kind of read certain things where I was like, okay, alright, maybe, and just kind of got to understand some of her arguments, and I'd be like, oh, well, I see what you're saying, no, not right there, not that part. So it's just kind of fun to do that, if you ask me. So anyways, bottom line, I encourage you to hate listen if you are open to that at the very least. If you're not so much of the conservative persuasion, it's okay. You can still listen to this podcast. As far as the podcast name is concerned, I am the type of person who can't even think of a good nickname when I play Jackbox or like Kahoot. Like, I'm just not spur of the moment funny like that, I guess. But I did come up with a name for this podcast that I do kind of like. You know? Subtle Rampage. I think it's a good one, because the reality here is that if it was considered mentally stable for me to sit here in a room by myself and just scream into the microphone for 30 minutes, that's what I would do, because that kind of is an expression of how I feel. But I was like, no, that would kind of be mentally unstable of me. So therefore, I'm going to sit in this room and go on a subtle rampage and use my words to express my feelings. So that's kind of the concept behind the name. But I do just want to clarify real quick as I wrap up this episode that even though I am going to be talking about politics on this show, it is going to be kind of more of a mixture of my opinions and my viewpoints on the realm of academia and higher education, culture, relationships, politics, literature, etc. Like, it's going to be kind of all those things and whatever else I feel like talking about. It's just everything is so kind of integrated with politics in the current state of our culture, okay, that it would be kind of stupid if I didn't say how I felt about politics. It would be kind of weird if I just left politics out of the conversation completely, because it really is involved in a lot of things. It is a big part of a lot of things that I will be talking about. So, all that being said, thank you for listening to this prelude episode of Subtle Rampage. I hope you'll listen to the first official episode that'll be coming out right after this one. And even though I'm not the type of person that follows the rule that conservatives don't wear glasses, I hope you won't deduct points for that. I hope you'll make sure to subscribe to the YouTube channel or follow the podcast on your streaming platform of choice. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time.